by looking at Parshat Naso a little bit carefully and trying to note the various mitzvos that are contained in Parshat Naso, I'd like to be able to reflect upon the function of the entire book of BaMidbar, or at least the mitzvahs that are contained in the book of BaMidbar. First of all, we have to deal with a very difficult topic, which is the chronology of the book of BaMidbar, because it says that, we opened up the book of BaMidbar by saying that it occurs at the very beginning of the second year that the Jewish people are in the desert, and yet we read about the dedication or the consecration of the Mishkan in Parshas Naso. So the question is, at what date does that dedication of the Mishkan, when is that taking place? It seems that we've already read about the dedication of the Mishkan already at the very beginning of Sefer Vayikra. At the very beginning of Sefer Vayikra, the Mishkan has already been built by Moshe Rabbeinu, and God calls out to Moshe Rabbeinu after the Mishkan has been assembled and after it has been consecrated. God calls out to Moshe, and there is Vayidaber Hashem Elav Me'ol Moed. God first speaks to Moshe and gives him the commandments. That's the very first pasuk of Sefer Vayikra. And yet, it seems, if we take a look at chapter 7 of BaMidbar, which is much, much later in the Torah, it's this week's Parsha. So it says, the chapter begins, Vayihi biyom kalos Moshe lahakimis hamishkan. The day that Moshe finished building the Mishkan, assembling the Mishkan. This goes back to the end of Sefer Shemos. We're going backwards in time. Vayimshach oso vayikadesh oso ve'es kol kelav. This is the first verse of chapter 7. Moshe anoints it, he sanctifies it in all of its vessels. Ve'es hamizbeach ve'es kol kelav. He sanctifies all of the utensils and the altar and all of its utensils. Vayimshachem vayikadesh osam. He anoints them and sanctifies them. Then, what happens after Moshe has assembled and consecrated all of the items in the Mishkan? Vayakrivu nisi'ei Yisrael Rashi Beis Avosam. All of the tribal princes approach and come forward. Heim nisi'ei hamatos, heim ha'omedim al ha'pekudim. These are the heads of each tribe, and they have a role to play in this inauguration of the Mishkan. Vayaviu es karbanam lifnei Hashem. Therefore, each one of them brings a korban before Hashem. Shesheglos tzav, etc., telling us all of the different karbanos, the animal karbanos, and the libations, and the flour, and all of those other things that they brought. Then the Torah goes into this very, very lengthy discussion, because as you can see, I just left off with Pasuk Gimel, and take a look at what's the Pasuk at the very end of Perek Zayin. It's one of the longest prakim in all of Tanakh. Pasuk Pei Tes. How many prakim in Chumash have a Pasuk Pei Tes? That's Pasuk 89. 89 verses in one chapter. That's very unusual, because it's a long, repetitive discussion of what each tribal prince brought the exact gift to the temple. And the Torah goes through each one of the tribal princes, and then at the very end of all of this, and it gives us a final inventory of what each tribal prince brought, and then it says at the very last pasuk, look at pasuk Peites, Uvevo Moshe el Ohel Moed ledaber ito. Moshe then comes into the tent of meeting, the Mishkan, to speak with God. Vayishma es hakol midaber elav. And he hears the voice speaking to him, me'al hakapores, from above the ark cover, asher al aron ha'edus, that was on top of the ark of the covenant, mibein shnei hakeruvim, the voice emanating from that ark cover between the two keruvim, the cherubim on top of the ark, Vayidaber elav, and it spoke to Moshe. Now, look at the very first pasuk of Vayikra, which in condensed form looks exactly like what's going on over here. These two events seem to be linked as the same event, but they're very distant as they appear in the Torah. As a matter of fact, the Ibn Ezra tells us, in source number 3, V'tam uvavo Moshe yitachein shetechilas hadibur shehu vayikra el Moshe haya ka'asher nishlama hachanuka. It would seem to me, says the Ibn Ezra, that this event of God calling out to Moshe at the very beginning of Sefer Vayikra is exactly what is being elaborated upon over here. Moshe finishes the construction and the putting up of the Mishkan. He then anoints it all. That's all at the end of Sefer Shmos. At the beginning of Sefer Vayikra, God calls to Moshe, but there's a little bit of an interlude that happens in between the time that Moshe finishes the construction and the consecration and the time when God calls out to him. And that is the Chanukas HaNesiim, the tribal princes offering their offerings. And that takes place over here. The Torah just inserts that part of the story in BaMidbar, even though it was omitted in that space between the end of Shemos and the beginning of Vayikra. It's very strange why the Torah chooses this kind of narrative, that at the beginning of describing how the whole process of bringing about this amazing structure and consecrating it omits the consecration of the Nesiim, the offerings of the Nesiim, and it waits until the book of BaMidbar to recap the entire story, elaborate it, and specifically elaborate on the gifts of the Nesiim. So we have to try and understand why that is. What's going on?
This is just a tiny question, but where it says Vayishma es hakol, it says Midaber Elav?
Midaber. As a matter of fact, this is one of those famous places where all the men are listening to the Baal Kriya to make sure he says Midaber and not Midaber.
Well, I didn't know if it was a typo or not. But
it is not a typo.
I'm thinking maybe that has something to do with this.
And yet you're on the ball as always. And so we're going to bring this out. We're going to actually, the Seforno actually accentuates the point that you just raised. Very good. And we're going to talk about it. So let's take a look. Another question that I'd like to ask that is related to this whole discussion is that immediately after God calls to Moshe, we finish Parshas Naso, and we begin next week's Parsha. We will not have a class next week because it is Erev Shavuos, right? So I might as well tell you a little bit about next week's Parsha as well. God gives Moshe Rabbeinu, he tells him to speak to Aharon. It's in source number 4. Daber el Aharon ve'omar to'ilav. Aaron, your job is daily to light the menorah. That's your job, Aaron. Rashi, trying to explain why this commandment of Aaron to light the menorah is placed over here. We already know that Aaron's in charge of lighting the menorah. Come on. We know this from the story of the priestly responsibilities that are listed in at least a couple of places before here. We know that it's written in Sefer Vayikra. We also know that it's written in Sefer Shemos, in Parshas Tetzaveh, which talks about the responsibilities. And one of those responsibilities is the lighting of the menorah. So Rashi has to tell us, why is this repeated over here? Rashi, in source number 5, tells us, Lama nismecha Parshas HaMenorah la Parshas HaNesiim. Why is it that this commandment of lighting the menorah is written over here, right after the inaugural sacrifices of the Nesiim? Lefisha keshera Aharon Chanukas HaNesiim chol shadaito. Because when Aaron saw that all the tribal heads were bringing their gifts, he had what's called a chalishus adas. You know what that means? To be chol shadaito? What's a chalishus adas? Your mind becomes weak or feeble. What that means usually in Talmudic terminology is that you've become depressed. And you sort of like, right, that's what it means. If you can imagine your mind doing that, that's what it means to have a chalishus adas.
Isn't it like a senior moment?
It's not a senior moment. It's a moment of great disappointment, of profound disappointment. That's what chalishus adas means. It means that Aaron was distraught. He was upset. And why was he upset? He was upset because he said, "Shelo haya imahim b'Chanukah lohu v'lo shivtam," that he didn't have a role to play in the consecration of the Mishkan. His tribe, the tribe of Levi, did not get a chance to bring their inaugural sacrifices. So Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu chayecha shelcha gedola mishalem. God says, "Don't worry, Aaron. I have a great consolation because your role is greater than theirs. Sha'atam madliku meitivis haneros." That your role is going to be to light the menorah. Now, there are a number of problems with this text. that Rashi is introducing us to. For one thing, we have to try and understand what is the advantage of lighting the menorah over bringing the inaugural sacrifices. The Ramban over here talks about the perpetuity of the lighting of the menorah, which alludes to the miracle of Hanukkah. We're not going to talk about that now. But the question is even more basic, which is, what is Aaron kvetching about? He's the big kahuna. He's the guy in charge of running the whole Mishkan. So why is he so upset? Why does he have this profound disappointment? And to the point where he's as chalisha sadas, he's so distraught. Like, what's going on? Why? He's going to be working every day for the rest of his life in the Beis HaMikdash, offering the karbanos on behalf of the Jewish people. Is that really a reason for him to be disappointed? Okay, so he didn't get a chance to bring a carbon to consecrate the Mishkan on behalf of his tribe. Is that such a terrible thing? That's their home base where they're working from. So at face value, just the whole thing seems very, very bizarre. So I'm going to offer you a thesis, and the thesis will probably hold up in most cases to contrast the book of BaMidbar to the book of Vayikra. And it may be a strange way of thinking, but hear it out and see if you can test it in a couple of places in Vayikra versus BaMidbar. When we read about the mitzvahs in Sefer Vayikra, God is instructing the Jewish people how to serve or worship God. And the function of those mitzvahs is worship qua worship. I want you to do these mitzvahs because in so doing you will be serving the Ribono Shel Olam. That's the purpose of the mitzvahs in Sefer Vayikra. It's all about karbanos. It's all about how to serve Hashem in a holy way. Sefer BaMidbar is more about the enhancement of the Jewish people through the mitzvahs. In other words, there are certain things that you, the Jewish people, need to do that are commandments, just like they are in the book of Vayikra. But the focus in the book of BaMidbar is not as much worship, but rather what actions will succeed in elevating you to be the people that you need to become in order to be able to enter into Eretz Yisrael and become the chosen people. If you look at the mitzvahs that are contained in Parshas Naso, you'll see that would explain why we have so many things that revolve around community, why we have so many things that revolve around making sure that the encampment of the Jewish people remains pure and holy, why we have the laws of Nazir and Sota in Parshas Naso, a whole list of things that we could go through that if we try to make it fit into this paradigm that I'm suggesting to you, I think they will all fit. It's in this context that the purpose of the consecration of the Mishkan was twofold. One is, in order for the Mishkan to work properly and to be a place for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to rest His divine presence, you need to do certain things to construct and to consecrate the Mishkan. And that's what the end of Shemos and the beginning of Vayikra concern themselves with. What needs to be done procedurally in order to make sure that God will rest His divine presence in the Mishkan. But the book of BaMidbar is not concerning itself with what needs to be done in order to get the Shekhinah to come down, but rather what needs to be done in order to make the Jewish people deserving of the visitation of the Shekhinah. How we elevate ourselves and become worthy of that. So the Chanukas HaNesiim, the inaugural of the Nesiim, is just that. It was taking the chief representative of each tribe and having that individual participate as a representative of his entire shevet, involving them in a certain kind of avod and a certain kind of divine worship, which elevates each one of the Shavatim and makes them holy, such that they deserve to have this connection to the Mishkan. It is a reflexive process. It's a reflexive act which elevates the worshiper in the process. In contrast to the previous part of the Torah, which is, this is how you serve the divine to make sure that the divine presence will come down into your midst. Okay? So if we look at it that way, then we understand why the Nesiim are not mentioned at the end of Shemos, the beginning of Vayikra. That's not necessary for Hashem to come down. But when we look at BaMidbar, it's necessary in order for us to be elevated, in order for us to be worthy of that divinity, in order for us to be worthy of being the God's people who can approach the Mishkan. This is what we have to do. And now we can understand what Aaron's profound disappointment was. What was Aaron's disappointment? I'm going to be working in the Beis HaMikdash. I'm going to be working in the Mishkan, I should say. And I'm going to be doing work on behalf of the Jewish people. But this is work that is worshipful work, which does not in any way elevate myself or my shevet. We are ministering unto others. We are ministering unto the Jewish people. We're ministering unto God. But we are not doing anything that is going to really elevate us in the process. At least not in the way that this Chanukas Hanesiim is doing, which is actually inherently altering or having some transformative effect on the tribes themselves. And if that's the case, what Hashem is reassuring Aharon is that there are certain procedures that you will be doing in the Mishkan that will actually have that transformative effect upon you. And specifically, the thing that will be transformative to you, Aharon, will be the lighting of the menorah. So if we look at it in that context, now we can understand this last pasuk that Mrs. and just I always forget your last name. It's a long last name. Sachachevsky. Right. So Mrs. Sachachevsky was mentioning is that why does it say midaber love, not midaber love, like it says in the beginning of Sefer Vayikra? But it says in the beginning of Sefer Vayikra, it's Vayidaber Hashem love, that God spoke to him. But here it's midaber. What does it mean, midaber versus midaber? What does midaber mean?
It's from himself. It's
like a hitpael. It's hitpael kimat. So let's see what the Sforno says. Take a look at the Sforno, which is source number 6. Midaber with a chirik. So says the Sforno, beino levein atzmo. God first speaks to himself before he speaks to Moshe Rabbeinu. Now that's very, very esoteric. We don't understand what it means for God to speak to himself. But what's the message? So he says, Ki kol poal Hashem lama'anehu. Everything that God creates, or every act of God is for his sake. Uvahaskilo et atzmo, and it's also for the sake that God can actually have a sense of self-understanding. Uvazeh yeda v'yetiv lezulato b'nedivut hashpa'a she'ein ba kiliyut. Let me explain what that means. That when God is self-understanding, is self-aware, then he can achieve a giving to the other with complete generosity, with complete effusiveness, which is devoid of any frugality. That's what kiliyut means. That is devoid of any miserliness. When God is self-aware and has a fullness of self, then he does not feel that he is in any way compromising himself by sharing of himself with others. And therefore, that's why he says, V'yera'eh pu'ula b'hitpa'el kefi hachanato. And that's why it's the language of hitpa'el, midaber. God is speaking to himself first, has this sense of self-awareness and supplementation. God is fully supplemented and God is fully augmented to be complete, if we can say that about God. And then he's at a stage where he can now share with others. And this is the ultimate message of the book of BaMidbar. That what the Jewish people needed to be aware of is that the mitzvahs that Hashem gives to us not only are unidirectional, that we give to Hashem, but they enhance us more than they do, more than anything else, more than our doing for Hashem. The mitzvahs that we do, especially the way that they're described in Sefer BaMidbar, are self-enhancing. And God models that for Moshe by first speaking to himself, showing how the commandment itself is self-enhancing, and once I've enhanced myself, I can share that enhancement with others. That's the purpose of the Chanukas HaMizbeach. That's the reason why the Nesiim were given the charge of consecrating the Mishkan so that they could be elevated in that process, become the chosen people, because once you become self-aware of that greatness, of that enhancement that you've acquired, you no longer feel that you need to hold back from being a light unto others. You can share effusively with others of yourself because you feel that sense of completeness. People who are stingy with themselves are insecure, right? But if you feel that sense of security, you feel that sense of confidence that I am fully augmented, I'm fully supplemented, I'm fully enhanced, then I can share freely with others. And that's the sense that Sefer BaMidbar wants us to have. It wants us to feel that sense of completeness that I have through the performance of the mitzvahs and through the receiving of the Torah. And that, in essence, I think is the most important part of this whole story, is that Hashem says to Aaron, don't think that you're sacrificing of yourself by working in the Mishkan. It's true that your sole responsibility is to minister unto others. But by lighting that menorah, you augment yourself. And just like a light can light so many other lights, the lighting of the menorah represents your ability to be self-lit, and with that light that is within you, you can light many, many other things around you. So that's the idea, and it's a beautiful message for before Shavuos, because whereas we talk about Matan Torah or Kabbalah Torah, the receiving of the Torah, as something that we accept upon ourselves, but the truth is that Shavuos is the time to reflect upon how enhanced we are through the receiving of the Torah. Not the yoke that is placed upon us through the being Jewish, through the receiving of the Torah, but how augmented we are. And that's the reason why Shavuos is considered by the Gemara as a greater day of joy than any other of the regalim, than any other of the shalosh regalim, more than Pesach, more than Sukkot, because it's a day when mankind has the ability to reflect how fortunate and how blessed and how enhanced I have become through this gift that God has given me of the mitzvahs and of the Torah. Have a wonderful day.